Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 54 and today we're looking at the horror of crucifixion. The term crucifixion is one that is almost a religious term now. We associate it so easily, so quickly with Jesus that we forget that it's a historical phenomenon and that it's something that happens to lots of other people. I mean, we think of the crucified Christ as if he is the only person who was crucified. But of course, even within the New Testament, Jesus isn't crucified alone. He's crucified with two other people, and that's something which you always get in art across the centuries, those two other men that were crucified with Jesus. And that acts as a reminder that this isn't something that's uniquely to do with Jesus. And the more that you look at ancient texts, the more that you see interesting evidence for this most horrific kind of capital punishment. There's surprisingly little archaeological evidence of crucifixion. In fact, there's only one crucified victim's bones that have actually been found. It's an unfortunate character called Yehohanan, and his bones were found in an ossuary, a bone box, dating to the 1st century. They were found in 1968 in a suburb north of Jerusalem. And one of his bones, the heel bone, is still wedged to the nail. The nail has gone through the heel bone. It's really chilling to look at it and see that reminder of how vicious crucifixion was. The nail itself has bent round a little at the end, probably where it's hit a knot in the wood, and it may well have been that they couldn't actually get the nail out of the heel and so buried the man with it, which is how we know that he is somebody that died from crucifixion. Seeing that little bit of archaeological evidence does make your blood run cold, and it does remind you that crucifixion was an unbelievably vicious form of torturing somebody to death. And the difficulty about crucifixion is that when you look at the literary texts on it, they don't really want to describe crucifixion. It's something which is fairly horrifying to them, and they don't really need to describe it, I suppose, because lots of people in antiquity have seen it and they're terrorized by it, so they don't actually describe it. So we have to kind of piece together what was involved just from hints in the literary texts. And this is the thing about crucifixion. It wasn't just about the pain, the agony and the torture and everything. That was involved, of course, but it was as much as anything else, perhaps more about the shame of the act. It's a public humiliation of the individual who is being crucified. It's not an honourable death like the death on the battlefield. And its purpose, really, more than anything, is to terrorise the population and to let them know that this is how you will end up if you are a rebel, an insurgent. And the thing is, they didn't just crucify anybody. The Romans would crucify runaway slaves, they would crucify people who were political insurgents, rebel leaders, this sort of thing. And it was an act of demonstrating to their followers, to the mob, to everybody, that this is how you will end up if you engage in that kind of activity. And it's an act of publicly shaming people who have tried to exalt themselves. My colleague here at Duke, Joel Marcus, has written an article on crucifixion as a parodic exaltation, by which he means that what the Romans were doing is they were trying to show that far from this person having successfully exalted themselves, now they were being engaged in this parody of their exaltation. So crucifixion was deliberately not just shaming people, but mocking them, holding them up to ridicule, something that we'll see echoed in the passion narratives in the Gospels as well. So when the Church Father Origen talks about crucifixion, he calls it the utterly vile death by crucifixion. And it was something that certainly wasn't for Roman citizens and civilized people like that. In fact, one of the most interesting stories about crucifixion from antiquity is when Cicero is writing in utter horror at the crucifixion of a Roman citizen, which he regards as something which should never, ever happen. So Cicero has this remarkable description of this crucifixion and tries to explain why it is so terrible for a Roman citizen to go through this. He says, but the executioner, the veiling of the head, and the very word cross should be far removed, not only from the person of a Roman citizen, but from his thoughts, his eyes, and his ears. For it's not only the actual occurrence of these things or the endurance of them, but liability to them, the expectation, indeed the very mention of them, that is unworthy of a Roman citizen and a free man. It's amazing for us as moderns to hear the way that Cicero would distinguish between a Roman citizen and others. As it doesn't even occur to him to say that crucifixion is an appalling thing for people other than Roman citizens. For him, it's all focused on this business of the crucified Roman citizen, how terrible that is. But in the course of talking about this character, he does mention one or two things that chime in with the Gospels, like the veiling of the head, which Mark may be reporting in chapter 14. And we find out a bit more about crucifixion by looking at the writer Seneca, who's in this argument about what the worst kind of death is, and whether or not suicide is in a way better than crucifixion. And he says, can anyone be found who would prefer wasting away in pain, dying limb by limb, or letting out his life drop by drop, rather than expiring once for all? Can any man be found willing to be fastened to the accursed tree, long sickly, already deformed, swelling with ugly wheals on shoulders and chest, and drawing the breath of life amid long drawn-out agony? He would have many excuses for dying, even before mounting the cross. And that passage is interesting, not least because you can see how the victim, as Seneca tries to characterize him, the victim is someone who is already, before mounting the cross, a deformed and scourged person. And this probably refers, these ugly wheals on the body, to the fact that lots of crucifixion victims would have this dreadful scourging take place beforehand. And it's something that's reported in the Gospels about Jesus as well. Just in half a line in the Synoptics, they say, and having scourged him, he was crucified. A little bit different in John's Gospel, but that scourging isn't something which is a mild thing in any sense at all. It is truly horrific. There's a truly nasty bit in Josephus, the Jewish historian, when he's talking about the scourging of another Jesus, a certain Jesus ben Ananus, and it says that he was scourged until his bones were laid bare. I mean, what a terrible, terrible thought that is. And speaking of Josephus talks about multiple crucifixions at the end of the Jewish War in 66 to 70. It was one of the ways that Titus terrorized the population there to try and bring them into submission to Rome at the end of that war. And Josephus says there in Antiquities chapter 20, the soldiers, out of wrath and hatred that they bore to the Jews, nailed those that they caught, one after one way and another after another, to the crosses by way of jest, when their multitude was so great that room was wanting for the crosses and crosses wanting for bodies. It's interesting there that you see the idea of the soldiers that were doing this, of doing it by way of jest. It is a really unpleasant and nasty picture that is being painted here of Romans who are doing these things in order to mock and terrify the populace. Now, when you look at the gospel narratives in the light of some of this material, there are one or two interesting things that emerge. One is that there is very little detail about what physically is happening to Jesus, and perhaps that's not surprising when we bear in mind that lots of these other writers in antiquity were very careful not to talk about the detail of crucifixion. It's the same in the Gospels. When they just say, and they crucified him, lots of the readers would know what this means and what is involved in a way that we don't fully understand that today. But equally, it's not just that they're avoiding the physical detail and the appallingness of what actually happens to Jesus, but it's also that one of the things they're doing is they're using the shame of crucifixion in order to make an interesting theological point. They have all of this mockery, this shaming of Jesus, and what they do is they turn it around and make it this kind of quite brilliant dramatic irony. So in Mark's Gospel in particular, when you look at the crucifixion of Jesus, it's almost like a coronation. He is crowned with a crown of thorns, and of course the reader thinks, and yes, that's a real crown in a way because he is the real king, and he's given the placard on the cross, the King of the Jews, and the reader thinks, well, indeed he is king. And earlier in the narrative, when they are mocking Jesus and they hood him and say to him, prophesy, there's rich dramatic irony there as well, because as they are doing this and beating him, they don't realize that they are actually fulfilling Jesus' own prophecy that this will happen to him. And what's more, while they're saying to Jesus, prophesy, outside Peter is denying Jesus in fulfillment again of Jesus' own prophecy. So all the way through the narrative, you have this rich, dark, dramatic irony. And I think it's something of the skill of Mark as a literary work that it manages to turn something that's utterly horrific as crucifixion into a story of Jesus' own exaltation. All the way through the gospel, he's kind of building up to this. The gospel all leads towards the passion. And then when you get to the passion, you get this story of Jesus's exaltation, Jesus's crucifixion as something where he is being crowned as king. And people who are mocking him don't realize how much truth is coming out of their mouths. It's a very clever way of taking the reality of crucifixion as a shaming, humiliating thing and turning it into an interesting, rich, dramatic, ironic story of Jesus' own exaltation to the highest place because he goes through all of this. I think as well, picking up from the previous NT pod, one of the things that's going on in the Passion narrative is by constantly quoting scripture, they're saying that however much it might have appeared that Jesus had reached the very lowest point that any human being can reach by being crucified, in fact this was all in God's will. That's one of the things that's going on. That's why they're quoting scripture all the time, I think. That's why the scripturalizing process is happening, because God's will is contained in scripture as far as they're concerned, and the way of showing that this isn't just some horrible accident is by narrating it using that scriptural language. Thanks for listening to the latest episode of the NT Pod. It's good to have your company. You can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com, on iTunes, Duke's iTunes U. You can find me on Facebook, facebook.com/ntpod, and thanks again for listening. Oh, one more thing. There's something about talking about torture in the ancient world and then just leaving it, which wouldn't sit very happily with me, because as a supporter of Amnesty International, I'm horribly aware, as I'm sure lots of you are too, that abuses like crucifixion, appalling torturing of people, isn't something, sadly, that's limited to the ancient world. And so whenever one is a little bit perturbed by the thought of these dreadful things, then might I encourage you to support Amnesty International too and the work that they do to end this kind of abuse happening in today's world.